All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're unpacking the gripping facts of a fatal collision and the incredibly rigid procedural lesson that makes this case absolute gold for bar takers. We're looking at Fajardo versus the Court of Appeals. It's a 2008 Supreme Court decision that brilliantly illustrates exactly what happens when a substantive defense collides head-on with a fatal, completely avoidable, remedial blunder. If you're studying for the bar, or if you're practicing appellate law, you absolutely need to know why this petition was thrown out before the merits were even fully entertained by the highest court.
So here's our agenda for today's explainer. First, the expressway tragedy. Second, evaluating police evidence. Third, findings of liability. Fourth, the procedural fatal flaws. And finally, Rule 45 versus Rule 65. Let's get into it.
Starting with Section 1, the expressway tragedy.
To really understand the legal stakes here and those massive damages that were eventually awarded, we have to look at the tragic events that unfolded on the North Expressway in Angeles City. The date was October 12, 1987. 4 victims, Alexander Dizon, Eduardo and Elizabeth Mangun, and Mario Gutierrez, tragically lost their lives. When the police arrived at the scene, which was about 500 meters away from the Magalan Angeles City exit on the Manila-bound lane, the aftermath was just devastating. An owner-type Jeep carrying the victims had fallen into a canal by the side of the road. But here's the crucial detail. A portion of that Jeep was actually still physically attached to the body of an overturned Isuzu six-wheeler truck, which was resting on its side facing northeast.
Moving right along to Section 2, evaluating the police evidence.
Now, what's really fascinating about this case is how the trial court relied so heavily on the rapid evidence gathering by SPO2 Romulo M. Bagsic. His testimony became the absolute anchor for the plaintiff's case. You see, Bagsic didn't just look at the scene and guess. He meticulously documented it. He prepared an investigation report based on the exact locations of the vehicles, the bodies, the scattered debris, and most importantly, the skid marks that indicated the exact point of impact. From all this physical evidence, he concluded the Jeep had been sideswiped by the truck. But here is the real investigative masterstroke. Inside the truck's compartment, Bagsic found a gasoline receipt bearing the name M. Fajardo. And he didn't just file it away. He actually traveled to the Caltex gas station in Balagtas, Bulacan, and verified with the attendant there that M. Fajardo was in fact the regular customer. This step-by-step physical and documentary evidence firmly connected the petitioner, Marcel Fajardo, to that exact six-wheeler truck.
But, cases are rarely perfectly tidy, are they? Strangely enough, after SPO2 Babarzik had a press club member photograph the scene and got the Jeep towed, he left the Isuzu truck to be towed by the CDCP, the authority in charge of the expressway back then. Well, when the police investigator returned, the truck was completely gone. Poof! The highway authority disclaimed any knowledge of its whereabouts, which seriously complicated the case and gave the defense a tiny sliver of hope to argue that, hey, maybe their truck wasn't the one involved.
Which brings us to Section 3, findings of liability. So, despite that missing truck, the defense comes in and presents an alibi. But, frankly, it was full of holes when you stack it up against the established facts. The defense actually admitted their truck met an accident around the same general time and place, but they claimed it merely fell on its side after hitting a pothole at 4 p.m. But let's look at the driver's timeline here, because it drastically misaligns with reality. The driver, Dakasin, claims he left the scene at 5 p.m., yet the official police dispatch to SPO2 Bagsic about the fatal collision happened at 6:15 p.m. Furthermore, Dakasin claims he didn't even report the accident to his employer until midnight before suddenly fleeing to Pangasinan. As you can imagine, the court saw right through this delayed, completely disjointed timeline.
And if that timeline wasn't damning enough, just consider this number, 4. The driver ignored subpoenas and actively hid for 4 entirely separate years before finally being arrested in June 1991. Between the overwhelming physical evidence gathered by the police, that verified gas receipt, and the driver's literal flight from the law, both the trial court and the Court of Appeals firmly established liability for damages. The appellate court even slapped double costs against the petitioner.
All right, pay very close attention to Section 4, the procedural fatal flaws.
Because now we are pivoting away from the substantive tragedy to a massive, fatal procedural blunder at the Supreme Court. Listen, you can have all the arguments in the world about the weight of evidence, but if you fail at remedial law, your case dies on arrival. So here is the crux of the procedural disaster. The petitioner received the adverse Court of Appeals decision on February 12, 2003.
Now, instead of filing a motion for reconsideration within the reglementary period like you're supposed to, they went straight to the Supreme Court on April 14, 2003, filing a petition for certiorari under Rule 65. And what did the Supreme Court do? They dismissed the case outright. Why? Because the petitioner completely skipped the indispensable condition of filing a motion for reconsideration. You absolutely must let the lower court, the Court of Appeals in this instance, have the opportunity to correct its own error first.
Now, the law isn't entirely without mercy, right? There are some highly specific exceptions to the motion for reconsideration rule. For example, if the order is a patent nullity, or if there's an extreme urgency regarding a perishable subject matter, or if the issue is purely a question of law. But here's the kicker. While the court noted these specific exceptions do exist in jurisprudence, the petitioner completely failed to prove that a single one applied to their case. They didn't even try to explain in their petition why they bypassed the motion for reconsideration. The court made it very clear here. Liberal construction of the rules is not a magical cure-all for a wanton disregard of procedural mandates.
Which brings us to our final section, Rule 45 versus Rule 65.
Let's look at this ultimate comparison, because this builds into one of the most frequently tested distinctions in appellate law. Aside from completely skipping the motion for reconsideration, the petitioner literally brought the wrong vehicle to the Supreme Court. They incorrectly used Rule 65, which is an independent special civil action, as a substitute for a lost appeal. What they should have done is filed under Rule 45, a petition for review on certiorari, which is the proper continuation of the appellate process from the Court of Appeals. Rule 45 is meant for correcting errors of judgment. Rule 65, on the flip side, requires a showing of grave abuse of discretion or lack of jurisdiction, and it strictly requires that there be no other plain, speedy, or adequate remedy available to you. In fact, the Supreme Court specifically defined grave abuse of discretion with these exact words, highlighting that a lower court simply weighing evidence differently does not meet this strict threshold. It has to be an arbitrary or despotic exercise of power so patent and gross that it amounts to an evasion of a positive duty enjoined by law. And honestly, nothing in the Court of Appeals review of the police evidence even came close to suggesting this level of judicial tyranny.
Applying that strict definition, we can clearly see the difference here. The petitioner's main complaint was just that the Court of Appeals relied on conjectures and gave too much credence to SBO2 Bagasik's testimony and that gasoline receipt, since there were no direct eyewitnesses to the actual moment of impact. To put it simply, evaluating police evidence, admitting documents, weighing testimonies, that is a mere error of judgment. It is not an error of jurisdiction. Because the petitioner's grievances were entirely about how the evidence was weighed, Rule 65 was the completely wrong vehicle for this appeal.
So, what does this all mean? Ultimately, because of these fatal procedural missteps, failing to file a motion for reconsideration and improperly using Rule 65 to try and cure a lost appeal under Rule 45, the Supreme Court dismissed the petition outright for lack of merit. The court affirmed the liability of the truck owner and driver, cementing the damages awarded to the victim's heirs, and finally bringing closure to a tragedy that began on an expressway over a decade prior.
Now, I want to leave you with this question to ponder. If you were the legal counsel handling this case, the very day that adverse Court of Appeals decision landed on your desk, how would you have strategized those next 15 days? You really have to think carefully about your appellate remedies, because as we've seen today, one wrong procedural move can literally erase your chance to argue the substantive facts of your case before the highest court. If you found this breakdown helpful for your law studies or your bar prep, please drop a like, share your thoughts in the comments below on exactly how you would have handled the appeal, and absolutely subscribe to our channel for more high-yield legal explainers. We love taking these complex cases and breaking them down so you can master both the substantive facts and the procedural rules. Thanks for hanging out with us, and we'll see you in the next one.